Good morning. Welcome to this 2020 day 2 of the Inclusion Collaborative. My name is Allison Posey. I'm here in Boston, Massachusetts, where it is lunchtime. We're looking at beautiful sunny skies, and I hear that your skies are clearing up and are blue again, which I'm really happy to hear about. I'm here today to chat with you about emotion, the brain, and learning. One of my favorite things to talk about. There are a couple ways that I invite you to participate in the conversation. There's a QR code, which if you scan with your phone, you're able to access all the slides on your phone or digital device. And there's also a link to the slides. It's a bit.ly, and the bit.ly has the inclusion Posey is the bit.ly name for that. So my Twitter, I do hop on Twitter, and so that's a nice, easy way, friendly way to be able to get in touch any time of the day. I'm at Allison A. Posey, and then please also feel free to use my email. So if you have questions during this that you don't want to post to Twitter, feel free to shoot me a private email. It's just aposey@cas.org. So again, I'm thrilled to be here with you today talking about emotion, the brain, and learning. My background is in mind, brain, and education. So I was a high school and community college science teacher, and I got to teach neuroscience for about 10 years. It was such a fun class to teach. And at one point I realized, all of this neuroscience background really has incredible implications for teaching and our teaching practices. So I went to graduate school for mind, brain, and education. And ever since then, I've really been trying to bridge the connection between what is happening in neuroscience research and what is happening in our classroom practices. And at the center of both is emotion. And so that's how this all kind of fits together for me. So our goals for this session are to deepen our understanding of the learning brain and ultimately to support student engagement and learning. So I would argue that the more we learn about our learning brain, the more we can support that student engagement and learning. And this is true whether we're in remote, hybrid, or face-to-face contexts. So as we start to think about the new challenges of this year and trying to reach all learners from the beginning, we have to think about engagement. We have to think about learning and how we can design to maximize both of those. So I invite you to pause for a moment and think about, what are your goals for this session? What so far has worked well for you as you've transitioned through some of the remote, hybrid, and classroom contexts this fall? And where are there some challenges? Because if you start to think about what's worked well and what are some challenges and what your goals are for this session, it'll really help drive the conversation and probably will help you pay attention in different ways. So I'm just going to pause for a few moments so you can reflect on your goals and what you hope to gain from this session. Again, you can post those to Twitter, #Inclusioneers, or at Allison A. Posey, or you can just take your own. If you're like me, I have my own little notepad and pen and paper. What are your goals? What are some challenges? What's working well? There are going to be 4 things we're going to talk about today, and I'm going to prime you with those, then we'll dive into each of those. So 4 key things that I think are critical for educators to remember about the learning brain. I think we already know all of this. I'm just going to hopefully highlight it in new ways so you can think about how they might inform your classroom practice. So the first, experience really matters, our background experiences. Second, emotions are always part of learning. You never check your emotions at the door. You never do social emotional learning and then academic learning. They are always together. In fact, executive functions and our frontal lobe evolved in service of our emotions. So they are always intertwined. Third, and I think we've all experienced this through COVID-19, our brain gets tired, and that is known as cognitive load. And fourth, reflection is actually critical for learning. It's key for learning. So keep these 4 ideas in mind. This is kind of our rough agenda of the morning. But first, as I often like to do, for those of you who know me, I want to start with a story. I love telling stories. So here's a story about a woman named Cheryl. So Cheryl was only 37 years old when she received an antibiotic after a routine hysterectomy. But unfortunately, the dosage wasn't quite right, and the antibiotic damaged the small hairs of her inner ears. And it really might not seem like a big deal, these small little hairs, but it turns out that in order to balance, to even sit upright, to even be able to hold your head upright, you need these tiny little hair cells in your inner ear. So without them, because they were damaged, Cheryl couldn't stand. She perpetually felt like she was falling. She would literally have to grab onto the walls to try to stand up. So this left her stranded. Oftentimes, she was bedbound, and she was unable to leave her home. And this condition was labeled as permanent. There was no cure. So imagine, being 37 years old and not even being able to get out of bed or even be able to sit up and hold your head up. But fortunately for Cheryl, as you might have thought, there's a twist to this story. Fortunately for Cheryl, she was able to work with neuroscientist Baki Rita, who understood brain plasticity. In other words, he understood that the brain is flexible, it's not fixed, and it changes based on how we interact with our environment. So you may have heard these studies of musicians who are working on a piece of music that might require a lot of rapid finger work. And actually what we see in the brain scans is there's actually an increase in areas of their cortex, their motor cortex, involved in finger movement. So when they start playing the music more and more, those areas actually get larger. And when they stop playing that music, the areas of the cortex get smaller. So based on our interactions with the environment, our brains literally change. And that can happen in short windows of period and just, a matter of days. And the exciting thing, I think, is that this plasticity is evident at any age. And you see evidence of that change in just a matter of days. So right now, your brain is changing based on what you do each day, based on how we are, we have been 6 months now in COVID and social distancing and, a lot of very big changes to how our day-to-day, how we're interacting with our environment. Our brain, you all know this, but we know this from neuroscience, our brain is changing based on what we do each day. Now, I'm going to get back to Cheryl. So with some rudimentary materials and a little creativity, here's a picture of her. You can see rudimentary materials. Baki Rita, the neuroscientist, rigged a construction hat, literally a construction hat for Cheryl. And this hat was connected to a strip of electrodes that she put on her tongue. And this strip of electrodes gave a little tingly feeling, kind of like sparkling soda or Alka-Seltzer. And Cheryl's job was to try to keep that electrode centered on her tongue. So when she leaned to the right, she could feel the fizz shift and she could correct her posture accordingly. And at first, she was able to stand upright within 30 minutes of using this. So imagine, right? Imagine that excitement of her being able to stand on her own after years of being confined to bed. And a lot of folks that, this is great, Cheryl, but they didn't think it would have any long-term effect, but Cheryl kept practicing. So with a little bit of work and practice, she was able to stand independently with nothing for an hour. With more practice, she was able to stand independently for a day. And after a year of practice, get this, she no longer needed the device at all. Her brain had changed. The sensory neurons in her tongue learned to do the job that the tiny hairs of the inner ear used to do. So the tongue cells were the ones that sent signals to her brain about her body position, and her brain could then send the signal to her motor neurons of how to position and how to hold herself upright. So it was through Cheryl's interactions with her environment that her brain changed in unique ways that were actually really meaningful for her. And so I share this because each of us has a brain with this remarkable plasticity. Our brain and our students have these brains with this remarkable plasticity. So we know our brains will grow and change in very unique ways based on our interactions with our environment. Our neurobiology parallels our lived experiences. So now 6 months into COVID, our brains have changed based on our interactions with the environment. And the exciting thing is that we have over a year with our students. Their brains will absolutely change based on how they're interacting with our environments. So that becomes really exciting for us, right? Because we can think about in what way do our learning environments, whether they're virtual, hybrid, or face-to-face, in what ways do our learning environments foster engagement? In what ways are we fostering community and high expectations? How are we valuing the full range of backgrounds and learning preferences? Or how are our environments fixed and disengaging, inflexible, or seemingly irrelevant, where we're requiring students, regardless of backgrounds and preferences and goals and their own personal interests, to do more or less the same thing at more or less the same time? It's really an exciting opportunity for us to take what we know about the learning brain and this amazing opportunity that we have right now. It's unprecedented in our times for us to be able to think about how can we design our learning environments, especially these virtual and hybrid and face-to-face interactions, so they're meaningful and they're goal-directed, where we have high expectations for our learners. So that's my story for the morning. I hope it, I invite you to take a moment and reflect, see if any questions come to mind, see if it, makes you want to do anything or think about anything in a different way. Cheryl's story. And if there are any questions or comments at this point, please feel free to let me know. Okay, thank you. So now we can use that story of Cheryl to think about how important our first bullet that we're going to focus on about the learning brain, and that's how important experiences are. So I live out here in Boston, and I wanted to share an analogy with you that you may not experience a whole lot in California. So I wanted to bring some snow to you. I kind of thought you might get a kick out of this. We're some nights approaching freezing, and I anticipate within a month or so, we're going to have some snow. So I really do like to use this snow hill analogy. So if you imagine it snows on hills. Now each hill, I know you have a lot of beautiful hills out there in California, each hill has its own unique shape. And I like to think of that as nature. We're each kind of born with a foundation of neurons. And based on what we do and how we interact with our environment, we're going to sculpt that. Oops, sorry about that. We're going to shape that snow hill in different ways. So for those of you who haven't been snowing, if they haven't been sledding, the first time you go sledding down a hill or skiing down a hill, it's actually really hard. And you have to work really hard to kind of make one of these, you can see some of these pathways that have been forged here. But then after you do it a couple times, that run starts to become really fast. And it's probably one that other kids are like, hey, let's go over there. Let's all go down that hill. And they sled more and more. And then that particular run becomes really fast and really robust. This is just like our brain when we learn something. The first time we're forging those neural circuits, it's hard work. The connections aren't made. And once we do something more and more, those circuits become really robust. The neurons themselves are myelinated. Protein channels and connectivity between neurons get stronger. And they're really robust signals that move faster. And other neurons are like, whoa, we know this. Let's do that signal. And it becomes easy. A lot of those skills become automated even. The first time you learn to play a piece on the piano or draw something or memorize the state capitals, it's just like those kids on the snow hill. It's a lot of work. And then you do it more and more, and it becomes faster and more automated. And so based on our experiences, we each have unique strengths and challenges. We each have what I like to call, and my colleague Todd Rose calls, a jagged profile. And we know in our classrooms, every student's going to have different background experiences. Some are going to already have neural circuits that are, they maybe have had families that use a lot of language or that do a lot of math or do a lot of collaboration. And so those circuits might already be really robust from them, from their previous experiences. And we're going to have other students who maybe haven't heard the vocabulary, haven't had that math sense, that number sense, maybe haven't had collaborative play, whatever the different backgrounds may be. So there's going to be that variability. And instead of thinking about it as, oh, well, this student's just gifted or this student just needs this accommodation, it's more complicated than that because the context actually matters. So you might seem really skilled in one environment, and then in another environment, it may not show in the same way. You may be, struggling to go down the snow hill again. So let me give you a visual to kind of highlight this. So we each have jagged profiles, right? We each have different strengths and challenges based on our background experiences. But also in different contexts, students are going to show different jagged profiles. So here, for example, in a physical science classroom, maybe in 4th grade, student A might not have a whole lot of interest. They might persist fairly well. They might have okay self-regulation. They might not perceive things really well. Maybe they're not seeing things well. They're in the back of the room. They have a noisy neighbor. For whatever reason, they're not perceiving things. Their language might be okay. Their comprehension could be high. Now, I've picked this particular list of skills from the UDL guidelines. But with jagged profiles, I invite you to take skills that you think are important for your classroom and your culture. And you can make this list and start thinking about or work with students to say, what's your jagged profile? Because we know that student A is going to be different from student B. But we also know that student A is going to change based on the context. So it could be that, student A in physical science classroom is this way. And then the next year in a different classroom, or maybe even the next day with a different unit, they might be really different. On day one, maybe when we're talking about volcanoes, they might not be very interested. But if the next day we're talking about spiders and they love spiders, their interest might be high and their persistence high, but they still might not have a lot of vocabulary or be able to show or communicate really well. So we know this jagged profile is going to change based on the context. And it's going to be different for every student. So this is all from an unlearning book that Katie Novak and I wrote. So I invite you to kind of think about these jagged profiles and the importance the importance that background experience plays when we think about our students, the wide range of students who we're going to have in our classrooms. So I'm going to pause there. It's the end of the first bullet point. Give you a chance to think about that, how critical that role of experience is. Maybe what's a time that you felt really skilled in one context and then you got into another context and you're like, oh. I had a student one year who didn't want to present verbally in my science class, but she was the lead in the school play. So I was like, oh, she clearly can present very well, but in my context, the science context, she didn't feel like she could. So I had to go through and think about, well, what could I do in the design of the environment to help her be able to present in front of her peers in this new context? What does she need? What could help engage her? What could help her build her background? And what could help her show what she can do in terms of her public speaking skills? So I invite you to reflect for a moment on this jagged profile, the importance of background experience in our classrooms. I want to see if there are any questions or any comments that you want to share. The second key idea that, again, I know educators have always known and neuroscience is now supporting is this idea that emotions drive cognition. So at every point in the day, our nervous system is constantly appraising, is this good for me or is this bad for me? And some of those appraisals are real. If there's a tiger in the room and my nervous system is appraising, this is bad for me, that's very real. My physiology could be at risk. But sometimes that appraisal is just what you anticipate or what you can imagine. So sometimes at night, before a parent-teacher conference, for example, I might be anticipating how I think a situation might be for me. And I might imagine it to be, different perhaps than how it might really be. So your physiology literally activates all the time. It's changing at every moment. Is this good for me or is this bad for me? And it can be real, anticipated, or imagined stimuli. So if you imagine this emotional activation, and if we think about it in terms of learning, there's always a spectrum. If you have low activation in your physiology, this could lead to a state of boredom. So right now, if you're kind of hungry and you're tired because you didn't get a good night's sleep, maybe you haven't had breakfast, maybe you've heard all this before, your physiology might not be very activated, and that's actually not a good place for learning. So you might think about, well, what are some strategies that we could do to get out of this state of boredom and get into this positive activation that's really good for learning? So maybe you need to go get a cup of coffee. Maybe you need to stand and stretch or do a little bit of yoga. Maybe you need to have some collaboration time or do some journaling or take some notes. What is it that could help take you out? Maybe you need to go to a different session. What could help you get out of this state of boredom and into a positive place for learning, for activation? So your literal physiology is activated to pay attention. And we want to help students learn the strategies they need. We don't just want a student to say, I'm bored, I'm not activated, I'm kind of disengaged. That's not okay. We want to encourage students to get the learn what relevant options they need to help them get to those learning goals. On the opposite end of the spectrum, if you have high emotional activation, that's stress, that's anxiety. That's also not a good place for learning. When you're overly stimulated, when your body appraisal is overly activated, like if a tiger were to walk in the room, you're not going to sit down and want to learn the quadratic equation at that point, right? You're not going to want to have a discussion about the causes of the Revolutionary War with your peers if you're in this state of stress. So again, with students, we don't want them to stay in this state of stress and never learn from us, but we want to think about how our learning environments, whether they're virtual or face-to-face, how can we really foster some different options so that learners can get their physiology in a place for productive learning. And this is where the UDL guidelines can really come into play. We can think about what options are there for students to build backgrounds. Could they watch a video? Could they read something? Could they have a graphic organizer? Is the vocabulary defined for them? What are some of the different ways they could show what they know? Can they use technology tools, assistive technologies, text-to-speech, speech-to-text? Can they have sentence starters? Can they have templates that they can fill in to help them show what they know? And importantly, how can we think about supporting student engagement? How can we make sure we're recruiting their interest? How can we use culturally relevant pedagogy to think about how we're using examples that are meaningful and relevant for students? How are students able to bring in items that are important to them, things that matter to them, things from their culture and their background that we can use to really show them how what we're teaching in school is relevant? How can we foster collaboration and give them frequent feedback so they know that they're on the right way, on the right track? All of these are options that help students get at our learning goals. But when we think about the nervous system, it literally helps activate our nervous system to be in a positive space for learning. Those options are so critical for helping to get students into that positive activation for learning. And I want to point out that having high expectations are really important to help get that emotional activation that's primed for learning. When students feel welcomed, when they feel they're part of the culture, that they're part of the community, and that all students have high expectations. It's not just for these students over here, or these gifted students over here, or this group level A is going to have this. That sets the expectation of different expectations. And that's going to shift literally the physiology and what we pay attention to and how we learn. So you may have heard the story of the Pygmalion in the classroom. This is a book and an example from the 1960s where they showed that they randomly selected some students and they told the teacher that these were the bloomers. These were the students who were going to do really well that year, and they were just chosen at random. But guess who did really well by the end of the school year? The students who were selected to be the bloomers. So our challenge as educators is for us to know that every single one of our students is a bloomer. And we can build, think of Cheryl, we can help co-construct the neural circuitry in their brains to learn. They're going to have different background experiences. Some are going to come to us with experiences that may help them in our learning environments, but we can scaffold by providing flexible options for students to be able to build the relevant background, to build the relevant skills they need to get at those high-level expectations, those high-level learning goals. So we know there's going to be this range of physiological activation. Anytime we introduce a unit, if we say, hey, today we're going to read from Great Expectations, some students are going to be like, woohoo, this is good for me. And other students are going to appraise, actually, this is not good for me. And they might start demonstrating behaviors of disengaging or trying to get out of the classroom, or, turning off their Zoom. And those behaviors are almost as though, the tiger's in the room and they're getting the heck out of there, which is probably the correct strategy for their body physiology. But if there are flexible options, if they feel like they're part of that community, that their emotions, they are emotionally invested in that learning with you, you're going to, I'm going to say you're going to see a difference. I will bet that you will see a difference in your students, in their learning, which is really exciting. So I want to note that one of a researcher, Sammy Daly, who used to work at Cass, she's now at the University of Rochester. She was affectionately known as the spit lady at a school. Of course, this couldn't happen in COVID-19 times, but our cortisol stress level hormone, our cortisol stress hormone, is present in our saliva. So you can literally, she would have kids spit into a cup and she could measure the level of cortisol that was in their saliva. And struggling readers had enough cortisol as though a tiger was in the room, a full sympathetic stress response before they even entered the reading classroom. So think about that. If these students, if their physiology was so high, they were in that stress, that fight or flight kind of mode before they even entered the reading classroom. Imagine they're not going to do well if you ask them to read aloud. They're probably not going to do well if you say, hey, it's 20 minutes of independent reading. When your physiology is that activated, it's not good for learning. So we really want to take a step back and think about, what are those tigers that are in our classroom environments? What are the tigers in our virtual online spaces? And how can we provide some relevant options that help students get at those high expectations and those learning goals? So that's point 2. So far, we've talked about how important background experience is, that learning and our brain, our literal brain structures are that combination of nature and nurture. We all have jagged profiles and they're going to change based on the context. And emotions are going to drive our cognition. They're going to activate our physiology for learning or to not learn. So again, I want to pause, give you a moment to reflect on what's resonating so far. If you want to post a quick tweet, if you want to shoot me a quick email, if you maybe are working with someone, you could share with a peer. What's resonating? What questions do you have so far? So it's a great question. So because profiles aren't fixed, there is not one inventory, and there's not going to be, it's never going to be fixed. So I would say what you want to encourage students to do is you want to come up with, what are the skills that are important for us in our reading classroom, in our science classroom, our music classroom. Maybe you're in an informal, we're going on a museum field trip today. What are the important skills for today? And where are you? How is your, so again, I chose this inventory from the UDL guidelines. These align with the 9 UDL guidelines. I find them to be really helpful. How is your interest in this? How much do you want to put forth effort and persist? How do you think you can self-regulate? And what's really exciting to ask students is where you think they're low. So like, let's say this student A is low in perception. They're not seeing or hearing what's going on. Is you can ask students, what do you need to help improve your perception? So you're not hearing what I'm saying. What can we do to change that? Would having a recording help? Would me writing it on the board help? Would us having, a buddy note-taking system, would that help with your perception? Because we want to be able to help improve students where they feel like they're low. And we can start to think about what are the different options that help them feel like they're shifting the context to be in a place that really helps them in their learning. And imagine how great it would be. So this is based on a teacher's example where her students were the worst behaved in their assemblies. So she said to them, okay, Here are the things when you're paying attention at a theater performance or in an assembly. Here are some of the things you need to be able to do. Think about where you are on that continuum and think about what you need to bring to this assembly to help you pay attention and engage with what's going on in the presentation for 45 minutes. So this is really meant to be a generative, flexible tool to use to spark conversations between students and teachers, or with students and their parents, or students to self-reflect on themselves. Because you've probably found with other surveys, it's not a fixed thing. I'm not just a type A person. In certain circumstances, I'm going to be more type A than other times. So when, that's my goal, to be super organized and type A, how can I help get myself there in that place? So does that help answer that question? I hope it does. And I would love to hear from you all. If you do use this jagged profile with your students, please share that with me. It would be so interesting for us to continue to gather examples from, kindergarten classrooms, high school classrooms, after school programs, different contexts, and seeing the ways that students are using them as a self-reflection tool to really help deepen their learning. And again, we can kind of think about it in terms of the physiology to really help them get into a positively activated place for them to do their best learning. So other questions or comments so far? It's a great question. Awesome. And this can be a quick exit ticket, do an exit ticket that focuses on content, and also just get students in the habit of self-reflecting on, how did you do today? Here was our goal. And, where were you? And what could we do differently tomorrow? And it doesn't have to take a long time. And as soon as you embed it into your habits and routines, it can really become part of the language. And sometimes, this is something I think is really interesting. Sometimes we just haven't defined, especially behaviors, well enough for students. So here's a personal example. My son was a competitive tennis player, and we would often say to him, be a good sport. You got to be a good sport out there on the tennis court. And he kept not being a good sport, and it was really starting to bother us. We're like, gosh, he really seems like a bad sport. We knew he's a good kid. What can we do about this? And finally I realized, what? I don't think we've defined or co-constructed what it means. This is going to sound, I put my academic head on. We haven't defined what it means to be a good sport. And so we said that kind of talked about it with him, and we came up with 5 things. Here are 5 things good sports do. And all of a sudden, he started doing those 5 things in his tennis matches. And he started looking at the professionals on TV and noting when they were or were not doing those 5 things. So it can be really interesting to work with students to kind of break open the language of behaviors and of learning and help them really think about, what went well and what didn't go well. So I look even on here like persistence and putting forth effort. Like, what does that look like? What does that mean? What does it mean to kind of have grit? Maybe grit is one of the pieces you put on here. Really define with students what it looks like. Scaffold that. Show model examples and non-model examples. Then the conversation of how did you do today, I think will be really much more meaningful in terms of what they think they need to be able to reach those behavior goals or those learning goals or those remote participation goals that you might be working on. And also notice how much I focus on the goal. The goal really matters because we can have all of these different lists, but if they're not in service of a goal, it kind of doesn't mean a whole lot. So make sure you have those learning goals on there. I'm going to add that to this image. Thank you for that question. So of course, here I do just want to highlight, I know I mentioned this, and here's where I really see universal design for learning as being a tool that can help us reframe our language to be about barriers in the environment. It's not about a problem a student has or a skill a student has or doesn't have. It's about barriers being in the learning environment. And we can think about the barriers being around engagement. Is this a barrier in engagement? Is this a barrier in how the information information is represented, so how students can perceive and understand the information? Or is this a barrier in how you can show what you know? And notice how this subtle shift in, instead of saying, this student is disengaged, and saying, what's the barrier for your engagement? All of a sudden, it's not a fault of the student, but it's a barrier in the environment. And that empowers us. That empowers us as educators. That empowers our students to be able to make a change. So if you're having students who are turning off their videos and don't seem engaged, instead of saying, oh, the student is engaged, say, what can we do to engage you in this conversation so you'll want to turn your video on? Would having flexible seating, would having the option for collaboration, would having a topic, bring a topic of your interest, connecting to the goals, what could be ways that we could design to engage students in that moment. So really, I think UDL in such a great way supports what we know about the learning brain. It supports those relevant options to get that physiology into that good place for learning. It really helps support students to build their background understanding so they can develop those robust learning networks that they need to succeed in our classes. So UDL really also helps us build the strategies and tools, and it helps us focus on the desirable difficulties. If there's a barrier, let's say in reading, let's say you're a history teacher and you're having students do a reading, and the goal is for them to understand, the causes of the Revolutionary War. And a student says something like, oh, do I have to, read all 20 pages? You might say, actually, the goal is not the reading. The goal is the understanding. So you could read it with a friend, you could have it read aloud, you could use a video to build your background. You could get that information in flexible ways because you know your learning goal. So really keep a focus on those desirable difficulties and think about how you can reduce barriers to engagement, to how students can build their background, and to how students can show what they know. And then, of course, UDL also encourages us to think about access. Do students basically care? Can they basically perceive? And can they basically show what they know? That's the access level of the UDL guidelines. If they can't basically do those fundamental things, they're probably not going to get to deep learning. So a really good place to start when we're thinking about providing these relevant options for students is at this access level of the UDL guidelines. So, I work at CAS, the organization that founded these UDL guidelines. I've been there for 10 years. I am still learning and still focusing on these guidelines. They can seem overwhelming at first, but just start thinking about those three big principles, asking yourself those three questions. How is the design engaged, help students build their background, and help students show what they know? And then you can start diving into the different suggestions for how to do that. And that lies within the UDL guidelines themselves. So there's a link, udlguidelines.cas.org, where you can learn more. There are videos, there's research behind each of the guidelines, there are downloadables for you, some FAQs, some frequently asked questions. All right, and you're probably feeling that at this point. So this is a good place to talk about cognitive load, because I would say at this point, you're probably done in your learning. We've been engaging for about a half hour here. There hasn't been a whole lot of interaction due to the nature of the video. I've tried to give you some stories, some times for you to pause and reflect, but learning takes energy. And that cognitive load, I love this image because it literally kind of shows how your brain can feel. And I want to make the important note that emotions are part of this. And one of the main things we've heard from educators, and I've felt myself in remote learning and COVID times, is I'm just more tired. I'm less productive. And I thought about my trip to the grocery store the other day. So it used to be I would go to the grocery store and I loved it. I'd pick out fun things to eat. I was often energized. I liked the little banter with the people at the grocery store. I go to Trader Joe's. I had such a great experience. And now when I go grocery shopping, I have to have my mask on. I have to stay 6 feet away. There's often a line out front. I don't want to touch too many of the produce items because I don't want to spread my germs and I don't want to want to pick up germs. I have to now stand behind plexiglass. I can't bring my own bags. I can't help bag. All of a sudden, going to the grocery store takes cognitive energy. And so then when I think about how I'm then able to go home and, put forth the energy I need to do my work or to engage, help my students, my children with their work and their homework, I am more tired. And that's because emotionally, I am also tapping those resources more in my day-to-day, more with COVID. I'm interacting more on Zoom calls than I ever have, and I'm not getting some of that energy that I would get from those face-to-face interactions. Right now, me talking to myself on my computer is not the same as me being face-to-face with you all in California. That is tapping my cognitive energy differently. So we not only want to think about the cognitive load of our assignments, look at your worksheets. How much of it's just straight reading? How much of it could you bullet and maybe add an image for? I had some math teachers the other day just taking a look at math problems, even just multiplying something like 12 times 37. Students have to remember how to multiply single-digit numbers. They have to remember how to divide up, writing the 14. They have to remember to carry. They have to remember to multiply and then add the carry. They have to remember placeholders. They have to remember to add. Oh my gosh. Even just multiplying two-digit numbers, there's a lot of cognitive load. If it helps students to have a calculator to be able to multiply simple numbers, let them use the calculator. If it helps to give graphic organizers to help them or a bulleted model example, give them those scaffolds. They're like training wheels. Eventually, they're not going to need the calculator to remember how to calculate 7 times 2. But when they're first learning something complicated, they're going to need that. And those supports go a long way. I'm teaching a grad course right now, and in our discussions, I started adding sentence starters. All of a sudden, for students to have a template with a few questions to answer to help drive the conversation, I'm getting such a higher level discussion out of my classes that it's like, I love sentence starters. I love templates. And I know students won't always need them, but they're there for them. And that really helps reduce their cognitive load. So I invite you to reflect here for a moment. How have you felt this fall and, through some of this remote learning time? How can you develop some scaffolds for you as an educator and for students in your classroom to help reduce their cognitive load, both their emotional cognitive load and their academic cognitive load? How could you look at your worksheets? How could you look at the amount of information that you're delivering and sharing and think about chunking and bulleting and images? And again, this is where we can use those UDL guidelines to think about flexible ways that we might, represent the information or let students show what they know or help them to engage in different ways. So I want to see if there are any questions, give you a moment to reflect on, how can you reduce the cognitive load in some of your work? So thinking about how we can use what we know about the neuroscience of cognitive load to really inform the way we design instruction so that students are able to take in the information and have meaningful conversations and just know that learning takes energy. And that's a good thing. The brain is an energy hog. A lot of energy goes to the brain. In fact, studying burns calories. So as you're thinking and learning right now, you are burning a lot of energy. So you're going to need to exercise and move around. You're going to need to get food. You're going to need to laugh and change it up. But students don't need it all in the same way at the same time. If I said right now, we all need to do 20 jumping jacks, I'm requiring that at the same way, at the same time, for everyone. And some of you might just be getting into your sweet spot for learning. Some of you might have needed that brain break, 10 minutes ago. So how can we provide flexible options for students to move, for students to eat, for students to, kind of have a little downtime when they need it? And I mean that for you as educators as well. Often, I mean, I'm speaking from my own teaching experience. I had 10 minutes to eat lunch, make photocopies, and use the bathroom. So often we have very rigid, fixed schedules. When we think about going back to school in new ways, I challenge our system to think about ways we can take in mind that we know the cognitive energy that learning takes. We know that we're all going to do it in different ways. We all know that our emotional activation is going to be different every day. We don't know what students are coming to us each day or, in between classes, what they've been through. Sometimes just an evil look from a friend is going to set a student into, their physiology into a different place. So how can we use UDL, culturally relevant pedagogy, and other tools to change our systems to be more in line with what we know about the learning brain? Big stuff, big stuff. No easy answers, but a challenge, a call to action. And finally, we know that we actually need restful, reflective times in order to learn. And I had a teacher the other day, we were talking about this exact topic, and this educator just said, "Thank you. This makes me know that my goal as a teacher is not just to cram information at them." Because when you do that, you're actually not respecting the way the brain learns or the way your brain learns. So I'm really happy that this is a recorded conversation. I hope you pause and you reflect and you go for a walk and you think about cognitive load, and then you come back to it and you think about the snow hill analogy. You go back and think about Cheryl, because just dumping information and then saying, okay, go to your next session, go learn, go be productive and pay attention is not the best way to learn. So what we find, actually Albert Einstein was great at this. He would often say he took many short walks during a day. And sometimes students need to just go take a walk for their own learning. Like that's how they get their emotional activation back into a good place. So let me share some of the neuroscience because I think it's really cool. So you kind of have these two neural networks that play off of each other. The active networks are so if you imagine when I say pay attention, and you're actively focusing and you're actively thinking and you're listening and you're processing. And now I'm going to say, so those are your active networks. And now I'm going to say, we're just going to have 30 seconds of quiet. Here we go. And I know that silence can feel painful. We're used to filling that silence with stuff, with our voice, with images, with things to do. But even in 30 seconds, usually, a few minutes is better. 30 seconds is not enough. But often what happens, and see if this is what happened to you, often what starts to happen is, and if we were looking at your brain in a brain scanner, we would see these default mode networks start to activate that are thinking more about your own physiology. Maybe you started thinking like, oh, I'm actually a little hungry, or, oh, I was sitting a little bit funny, or, oh, this kind of connects with me. And you might have started thinking about cognitive load a little bit, or your trip to the grocery store. And then what tends to happen when you're in these default mode networks is you start to empathize with others. So actually in my 30 seconds, I started thinking more about you all. I started thinking, how are they doing? I can't see you, I can't hear you, but I started wondering, how are you doing? And I kind of got outside of myself a little bit. And if we're really wanting students to learn how to empathize with other humans, to empathize with their peers, to think about, what's happening in Texas as a hurricane is coming, what's happening to a neighbor down the street as the fires are here, how do I keep myself safe? If we really are trying to build these skills of empathy in our communities, which I would argue is some of the most important learning that we're scaffolding in schools, we really need to think about how we invite this restful and reflective time. It is not a waste of time. It's not downtime where kids are doing nothing. This is some of the most important learning time we can have. And again, we all don't need to do it in the same way and at the same time. We know that, right? We know about those jagged learning profiles. We know about our different backgrounds, our different interests, and at different times we want to focus, we want to engage, and at other times we need to check out and chill out. And this goes for us as educators as well. So in one of my books, I described my my Super Bowl meltdown, where I basically had burned out as a teacher. And I would argue now, looking back, it's because I wasn't giving myself this reflective, restful time to recharge. And I needed to do that better in my day-to-day, given the full schedules that we have as teachers. So I invite you to reflect, to share. How do you invite time for students to reflect on their own learning, on the meaning they're making, even on how they're doing with, in the course of their day? And again, please don't ask students to all share. I know right now we want to know how students are doing. We're wanting to check in socially and emotionally on how they're doing, which is really good. But asking students to go around and share verbally how they're doing is not effective practice. Some students are going to shut down with that. Some students are going to get into that full threat mode. If you say share how you're doing right now, that's going to put some students into high anxiety. I'm telling you, I would be one of those students. I don't want to share how I'm doing with you right now. But if you ask me to journal about it, or maybe share privately, or maybe go talk to a peer or someone else about it, there are flexible ways to check in with students. That's a much more effective way than going around a circle and making everyone say how they're doing, if you want to get genuine responses. So really, thinking about how are you inviting flexible options for students to reflect as they need on their learning and how they're doing. So with that, I just want to give, a summary, and just invite you to share, what's resonated, what questions do you have, what's one action you'll take? And just as a quick summary, all of these apply to students and us as educators. Make sure you know your goals, anticipate barriers that your learners or you will face, and then design those flexible options with those high expectations. And know these 4 facts about the brain, that our background experiences really matter. But like Cheryl, our brains are constantly changing, so we get to build neural networks with our learners this year. Emotions are always part of learning. Our brain gets tired, there's cognitive load, and reflection is key for learning. So I'm excited to hear from you now. What's resonated, what questions do you have, and what's an action you will take? Yeah, so as I am so guilty of this one. It's almost like you turn in the exit ticket and then you're allowed to go. It's like, no, we're taking 5 minutes for this, and I know not everyone needs 5 minutes. Some will be done earlier, so you'll want to, give some other options. If here's a place to doodle. Here's a word bank. Here's a model example. Here are some sentence starters. Here are some things that other people have said that might help jog your thinking. We have to think in a UDL way. What are options that we can provide students to get them at that deeper level of reflection? Talk about, what does good reflection look like? What is meaningful reflection? How can that inform our actions? So really scaffold that skill. They're not going to get it right off, but we really need to kind of shift and actually unlearn some of our old practices, and then trade up, knowing what we know about this. Really try to change our schedule a little bit, change the way that that we scaffold them to do that. So I hope that's helpful. Yes, and again, don't require them to share it with everyone, because again, having to put your feelings up in front of other people, it's going to shut some kids down. And if your goal is to really learn how they're doing, they can do it in flexible ways. They can draw, they can write. I even had a student where I said, you can text me. And that student every time would text me. It was a student who I really thought was disengaged. I just needed to open up another means for communication. So texting even worked. I had to be willing as a teacher to take the texts. That might be a line you want to draw, but really thinking about what are the flexible ways. The goal is the check-in. The goal is to make sure that students are checking in and that they're doing all right. And then say, here's kind of the menu. Here are some of the flexible ways that you can do it, some flexible ways to show it. some flexible ways for them to learn how to do it, scaffold their vocabulary, scaffold their understanding of how to do it, and then scaffold the why, share why it matters so that they're interested, they're engaged in it. They're not just gonna, otherwise they will just check it off. I will too. So you have to really convince me that this is an important piece to the learning, that will really, if they're able to come up with some options that help them with their learning and they see you incorporate those, if they're able to share, ideas for how to make the lesson more engaging the next day and they see some of those come to life, they're going to buy into the process a little more than if they think it's just, kind of a checklist. So yeah, thank you. Thank you for emphasizing that one. I have seen such tremendous impact of that change on learners. It is one of my favorite things. And of course, we know this from, it's the social model of disability versus the medical model. For so long, we've been stuck in that medical model in our classrooms, that there's something we need to fix about students. No, we don't. The students are awesome. They are who they need to be. The barrier is in the environment. And when we change that, we see differences in how students engage and learn. It's so exciting. Thank you for emphasizing that. Great. Oh, okay, that's my favorite part. Awesome, awesome. Yeah, imagine how different this would be without the story of Cheryl. I just think kicking off with stories any way we can, and I want to hear your stories. So really inviting that open conversation really invites that community. Thank you. Great. Yeah, awesome. And it could be kind of like my son with being a good sport. You could have really different ideas, and it's important to learn because our ideas are based on our background experiences, and they could be very culturally different, and they could end up being disrespectful of our students. So we really want to be able to build a shared language for that. Awesome. So I want to thank you all. So I have additional resources, some articles, some videos, a whole online class if you want to get grad credit learning about the learning brain, a quick reference guide, some books, some research articles. So hopefully there's a whole range, some flexible options for you to continue to build your background. And please be in touch with me. Again, there's my email, there's my Twitter, and thank you so much for your time today. I hope you all have an amazing rest of your conference, and good luck this year. We're thinking of you all on the East Coast. No, we're thinking of you all cheering for the rains and for clear skies and for a safe school year. Thank you so much.